what makes a text sacred? This was asked by John Perman Brown in 1993, one of our professors, and each year now, 26 years, we've had an evening lecture exploring sacred and text. We've had texts that are in canons, we've had texts that are wholly new and vibrant, and we've had poetry, we've had sacred texts from other religions, we've had art, hymnody, all sorts of approaches to this. So it's been a wonderful, and it will continue each year about this time of the year. I want to ask a few people to stand and be recognized. Nancy Solari in our first row has been one of the sponsors of this sacred text event and chair of the committee. And a very good friend of the library as well. Kay Edward Dixon in the back is our director the director of library services. I used to be the director of the library. Now we're really focused on ways that we reach out to people, engage people, and so it's really not just about being custodian of educational resources, but creating events and happenings that enrich the life of our students and members of the community. And his assistant, Carol Wolf, oh, she's not here.
She's not here.
All right. Kyle Scheffelbein Guerrero is here, and he is our Director of Digital Learning. And he and Eduardo Cristino and Deandra Cregan are making sure that our live streaming audience can also participate. This will be filmed as well, so that you'll be able to go back to it and look at it on our website. So these are all the ways to kind of extend education. And now there is food that will, whatever's left will be available afterwards. We invite you to stay for conversations with each other, to turn off your phones and other vibrating devices. And I will introduce Arthur Holder, who is a professor of Christian spirituality and the director of assessment and also the accreditation liaison officer for the school, and he will introduce our beloved Barbara Green.
I'm very deeply honored to be asked to introduce tonight's speaker, who has been my colleague, my friend, and my co-conspirator for many years. My only fear about this was that I wouldn't find anything new to say, because introducing Barbara has become something of a regular thing for me over the past years, especially during my time as Dean of the GTU. First, I introduced her when she gave the Distinguished Faculty Lecture in 2004, and then I introduced her as the GTU Alumna of the Year in 2011. And then in 2016, just about the last thing I did as Dean was to introduce her at commencement that year as the recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award. So I thought I'd kind of said everything there is to say, but fortunately, she has continued to be amazingly productive and creative, so there's always something more to add to the ever-growing list of her accomplishments. Some things, though, that I've said before are still true. Sister Barbara Green has been a member of the Dominican Sisters of San Rafael for more than 50 years. She holds a BA in Latin and Greek from Dominican College of San Rafael, an MA in Theology from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, as it was then, and the GTU, and a PhD in Near Eastern Religions granted jointly by UC Berkeley and the GTU. She's been teaching biblical studies at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology since 1992, and has been a member of the GTU core doctoral faculty, active both in biblical studies and in Christian spirituality since 1994. Barbara's major research interest has been throughout in literary history, literary theory and hermeneutics, and the reading of biblical texts, which of course makes her the perfect speaker for this annual series of the reading of sacred texts. She's published 7 scholarly monographs, of which I will mention by title only the first and the last. First, in 2000, The Quest in Contemporary Biblical Studies for a Comprehensive and Coherent Methodology, grounding both critical theory and committed practice within Christian spirituality, led her to publish a book on a Russian literary theorist, Mikhail Bakhtin, and biblical scholarship and introduction. Most recently, I think it's most recently, last year. You published anything last month or so? Okay. Last year she published David's Capacity for Compassion, a literary hermeneutical study of 1st and 2nd Samuel. In between those two, she published both books and articles on a number of figures in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, including King Saul and a host of J characters, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jonah, and Jonathan. But she hasn't been content to leave it with the interpretation of biblical narratives. Barbara has also gone into the business of constructing her own narratives. She has self-published 4 academic mystery novels featuring biblical plots transposed to modern times. The first 3 of those novels are set at the GTU, including one involving a theft of objects from the library. But we're glad she's here anyway. Now, sad to many of us in many ways, but happy in other ways for her, after 50 years devoted to teaching and advising students, 25 of those at DSPT and the GTU, Barbara will be leaving the active teaching faculty here at the end of this academic year. I asked her what she plans to do, and she has many different possibilities, but one of the things she's exploring is active engagement in prison ministry, working with offenders who have been released and working their way back into the community. As her many students will attest, she never fails to challenge us with fresh insights into the biblical text, and at the same time, into the depths of our own human experience. So buckle up, get ready for an exciting ride as she offers us the gift of a lecture entitled, "Can We Do That? Reading Sacred Texts as They Read Us." Please welcome Professor Barbara.
Thank you. That was lovely. I hope many of you know Professor Robert Greenberg, music historian in residence with San Francisco Performances and popular presenter with the great courses offered by the teaching company. In one of his many courses, overviewing shifts in Western music, he plays for us motifs we likely already know, but now recognize as powerfully innovative, since we are moving in chronological order and with vivid commentary on the music's historical and social contexts. Let me, with help and luck, sample 3 such moments and offer appropriate Greenbergian comments. Can he do that? Greenberg will squawk to imitate and stimulate incredulous audience members. Or, can he do that? Finally, How can he do that? Why would he? And, adds Greenberg, how will we learn to hear and understand such sound so that it becomes pleasurable and productive for us, as it may not be when we first hear it? We can do a similar thing with visual texts. Consider 3 images of Jesus the Christ. Ecce homo. A Rembrandt, and Chagall. Can they do that? Why do they do that? We may not be immediately drawn to all of these or drawn evenly. Perhaps we once did not prefer one of these, but now love it. Human faces change less than music does, though it is not fortuitous that this is not just any face. So how do these sacred texts affect us? How do we respond to them? Why? How do we read these texts? My hope tonight is to reflect on the dynamics and experience of reading sacred texts. It is, of course, a vast topic, but we will move quickly, touching on what our forebears have thought and done, what has been more recently ventured, naming some fresh challenges and opportunities. Of the many sacred texts longing for our attention, I have chosen 2 large ones, but short scenes from each for us to consider briefly now and perhaps later at leisure. I bring old narratives, nothing jangly postmodern. Our challenge tonight is not to accommodate the unfamiliar and jarring, but for our sophisticated and screen-jaded selves to manage very ancient narratives. Tonight's texts are rough contemporaries. Homer's Iliad and the David narrative from the Bible's 2 Samuel, both 8th century or thereabouts. Our scenes to read feature Priam's beseeching Achilles for the body of Priam's son Hector, slain by Achilles, and King David's journey to and from arrogance toward God and humans. My theme is compassion, how it can be proffered to us by the authoring processes that produce sacred classics like these, and how we, reading, may engage them. We will look at one visual artwork and near the end sample one more musical and textual classic. You have a handout so that I can move rapidly and responsibly, and you will see where we are and not worry that the library may close for the night with us still here. May I, before starting seriously, thank the GTU Library and its friends for inviting us here to read. I also want to thank Arthur Holder for his life of helping many people come to be sensitive readers of sacred texts. We also think of and thank, on his 50th death anniversary, Martin King, brilliant interpreter and performer of sacred texts, whose readings set a high standard for our engagement and from whom we continue to learn deeply compassionate reading. The point I wish to explore: when we read our most sacred texts, we need to be intensely present to and with them, offering them fresh questions, aware of the moves we are making, who we are, what we are doing, what we can ask of texts, and how we can receive what they offer. Such a hermeneutics offers our texts the space to utter more than their authors may have known when composing, helps us to generate fresh insight from their brilliant scores, leads us to insight, wisdom, and to compassion if we are up for it. So, what can we do? How can we do it? and what happens as a consequence of doing it well. Let us begin with 7 hermeneutical points marked on your handout. So, first, the ancients thought that sacred texts were generated ultimately by the gods, or at least by more than human muses, who assisted poets to recall and recite deep truths. Biblical texts valorize similar moments when God communicates distinctively, even uniquely, to Moses, but to others as well, words that become sacred. Many pre-critical scholars, those many living before the key events clustering around the 17th century in the West, were more likely than we are to attach significance to the exact arrangement of words, though even modern scholars have spent much time trying to reconstruct the original or earliest possible utterances. But the challenge posed to our text by modernity, specifically after Galileo, Darwin, Freud, and Einstein, or challenges posed to the usual way of reading texts, that is, allegorically and with a default literalism, those thinkers did these texts and interpreters a big favor, since we were forced or freed into new interpretive realms. 2, many moderns, including myself and many of you, hold firmly and post-naively that our sacred texts are indeed God's rich self-disclosure to and with us, even if we cannot confidently explain the process. Indeed, explaining the genetics of our text is not the main quest. The point is to engage them, alert to where they can bring us. Sacred texts address us with the deepest mysteries we can ponder. They know what they are doing, but we need to be in the loop as well. Texts anticipate and accommodate our questions about deity and non-deity, about creator and creatures, immortals and mortals, how our struggless paths cross as fruitfully as possible. Classic scholars maintain that the Greeks did not consider their gods beneficent, but rather prone to act for their own best divine outcomes, assisting a few special humans occasionally if it could be managed. Jews and Christians tend to hold that God is loving and caring, perhaps permissive, but few whatever days for biblical God. Some challenging ones, as we know, for us reading. Biblical God is no pushover. 3, humanity's sacred texts explore with us the deep and fraught question of how what we call deity is involved with us, helping or hindering, perhaps indifferent or possibly approachable. Our sacred texts query and explore how God is mysteriously active in diverse ways. We recognize this as an ancient question and also as an urgent one in our own day, as cognitive science and cosmology offer us staggering new ways to frame these matters. But tonight is not to talk about brains or stars, but about our narratives, verbal, visual, musical, spiritual. Moderns may, in the sunlight, banish the question of who God is and who and what we are, may go about our business with great aplomb. But at nightfall, especially as death comes near, our own or those we love, we grow wiser and reach for our sacred texts to consult them afresh as we have deeper questions and experiences. Point 4, contemporary hermeneutes, theorists of meaning, advise us that we do well to know as much as we can about historical and social events pertinent when our texts are set and were produced, while recognizing how inadequate is any retrieval. But to read responsibly, we must do our best. What our sacred texts proffer, however, is not exclusively or primarily these largely submerged worlds. But this is a controversial point. Homeric scholar Seth Shine asks whether it is legitimate to pose to a text a question it will not have specifically addressed. That is, can we ask old texts new questions? Can our texts raise issues their authors likely scarcely imagined? Shine's answer is no, they cannot, but I want to counter that view. Insofar as our texts are not containers of information, but mediating scores like music annotations, they can grow when freshly performed and absorbed. So in addition to retrieving or constructing original context as best we can, we need also to attend carefully to the infinitely rich literary fabric of narrative, which will provide access to most of what we need. Before turning to our two texts, let me name an insight arriving with fresh force during the lifetime of virtually everyone in this room. Our reading of sacred texts is profoundly influenced by the selves that manage the eyes that read. If objectivity was once the esteemed condition for reading sacred texts, such is no longer the case. To drive this point more powerfully, let me offer an example of a friend of mine who learned only in her 40s that she was adopted. She knew her adoptive parents well before learning this fresh fact. But once confronted with new information, she had to meet them afresh. Our experience typically accumulates more slowly than that, but the point remains. Who we are matters to how we read, and that who needs to be on the prowl rather than settled and complacent. Point 6, when we read, there is no reason for us to consider ourselves Lone Rangers. We need reading partners who do not lack. We have libraries and libraries have friends. Sacred texts know no Lone Rangers. Finally, 7th point, we need to read boldly. Sacred texts are at their saddest, languishing on coffee tables, gathering dust. They are often unhappy at church as well, when asked to validate the same banal insights repeatedly. Let us risk fresh questions, seek new insights. If unsuited, over time, our quirky readings will be identified as such and slip away. Too much sameness is not good for our texts or for us. Let's now practice and query these points by reading our texts. So, Homer's Priam and Achilles, compassion, whose, and how. Our first scene comes at the end of Homer's Iliad in Book 24, near the end of the Trojan War, where the Greek hero Achilles, trapped in a primordial anger that is both socially sanctioned and divinely assisted, has killed Hector, son of Priam, king of Troy. Achilles has also refused to give Priam and Hecate the body of their son for burial, a rite necessary both for human consolation and for freeing the mortal spirit to enter the realm of the dead, rather than languish between earth and underworld. Hector's parents must watch Achilles' chariot drag the body of their son round and round the walls of Troy for 12 days. Priam's challenge is to ask the killer for the body and to gain his assent, 2 major deeds. In this quest, though no character can assume it, the gods have already assisted, nudging Achilles to release the body. How will Priam approach Achilles so as to gain his request from this man, alienated as Achilles is from his own humanity? How will Priam catalyze from Achilles a gesture of mercy? How will the experience of both men, 10 years of slaughter, have prepared them for this moment? Poorly, we may suppose. Let's contemplate what they do. First, Priam goes from Troy toward Achilles' tent, accompanied and advised by Hermes in disguise, the messenger god for whom our philosophical practice of hermeneutics is named. Couldn't be better. So Priam, in deep and visible mourning for his son, perhaps grieving in anticipation of all else that will soon be lost, approaches Achilles with respect and is received with courtesy. Priam, king of Troy, comes alone to the hero's tent, Hermes having bidden him farewell, and falls at Achilles' feet, kisses his hands. Priam comes as close as can be done to standing in Achilles' experience by reminding Achilles of his own father, Peleus, and implicitly of his son, Neoptolemus. Thus prompted, Achilles' lethal hands, bathed in the tears of the father of the man he has hated, the Greek hero responds with the greatest graciousness he will ever manage. Extraordinary, since Hector has killed the one Achilles loves best. We are perhaps accustomed to this respectful and courageous encounter of these two God-assisted mortals, such that we no longer marvel at it. Achilles weeps, as does Priam, also now speaking of his own sons, most now dead. The two sup together, weep together, reflect on the events of the past 10 years as well as on what is about to come. Achilles, who has withstood virtually every request made of him in 23 previous books, accedes readily to Priam's request for his son's body. That I can say it so simply here does little justice to the nearly 16,000-line poem that has deferred this gesture from Achilles until this moment. Classical scholar Elizabeth Vandiver suggests that Achilles has realized that his vengeful actions are not making him feel any better, and so he orders the body of Hector be bathed and anointed and returned to his father. Achilles' anger seems blunted, if not gone. Seems easy, but we know better. It is claimed that Achilles acts with compassion. I find his deed gracious, agree he does well. But the scene develops. When Priam presses for more, Achilles slips back into his anger and threatens his guest, such that Priam decides not to accept the knight's hospitality offered and prepared for him, but to return to Troy with his son's body. The compassion on offer here, for us, reading sacred texts, is Priam's. There is in it a desperation to claim his son's body, return safely himself to his besieged city. His challenge is to act with both success and integrity, and it seems to me that his choice is empathy, what Mikhail Bakhtin has called sympathetic co-experience. But how will Priam have been able to kiss the hands that killed his son? How do such a thing at all, let alone with integrity and with the desired effect on Achilles? Can he do that? How can he do that? How do we read it? And of course, can we do likewise? How to prepare for such a deed if we wish to do so? Let me describe what I think we have. Compassion is the capacity for one of us, knowingly and willingly, to shrink our to-be-gratified self so as to leave space to approach closely another whose need is great. The challenge is to move close enough to be present, neither disappearing into the other, nor smothering him or her by our presence. The compassionate person will not deny his or her own deeds, but can act for the other's more urgent good, trusting that no ultimate harm will be suffered by doing so. The Hebrew language wisely roots one of its words for compassion in the word for womb, since a woman so carrying a child shares her substance and strength with it, acting for its good and trusting that her own will not be harmed. The writings of John the Evangelist and Paul echo this same paradigm for Christianity's core action. But compassion, as we are speaking of it here, is entered with deep awareness and will, must be practiced repeatedly in ever-changing circumstances. To embody compassion needs wisdom and grace, such as Hermes provided from the gods to both Priam and Achilles. A lifetime may not suffice. Homer does not explain how Priam can act with compassion amid such diverse circumstances, but he sketches possibilities for our rumination. Let me name just one. The city is thoroughly patriarchal, hierarchical, violent, battening on honor and glory, where the worth of a few elites is sustained on the backs of the many. Priam is Troy's king, chief beneficiary of all its opulence, though also standing to suffer most when his city falls. But earlier in the poem, Book 3, when Priam addresses Helen, the woman who has occasioned and perhaps helped cause the 10 years of war, the poem remains ambiguous about whether Helen went with Priam's son Paris willingly or not. Priam addresses Helen with courtesy, treats her with respect. We are shown Priam living amid very flawed and hazardous circumstances in which he is substantially complicit, nevertheless treating a dubious guest with respect, whatever others may be doing and however he may feel. Respect for and courtesy to opponent is good training for compassion. So Achilles is not the first opponent Priam has respected. Perhaps virtue accumulates, or better, perhaps compassion is more a muscle than a secretion. Sacred though they are, our ancient texts are flawed, can be cited for shortcomings we readily name: sexism, violence, misogyny, classism, and so forth. I hear David on the next page shuffling his feet nervously. We can, must on occasion call attention to the flaws in our text, lest we, remaining blind, reinscribe their deficiencies in our own lives and those of others. But sacred texts do not reduce to their flaws. Are we able to read with skillful compassion the flaws of our texts? Can we do that? Let's practice on our next one. King David's arrogance, compassion, whose and how. David's failings are likely more familiar to us than those of Achilles. He is not short of shortcomings. Bathsheba, so often linked with David's sins, has asked us for the night off, however, since she has been in demand recently, along with Anita Hill and others. So much to do. So David's sin to be read here is not his most famous outrage, but one more basic, more pernicious. Since being called from the sheepfold and anointed secretly, David has been given a long internship preparatory to his rule. Early on, David has expressed a deep relationality with God. We, reading, may feel that God has been permissive with David. But in recent narrative time, David has taken advantage of his status with God. Formerly accustomed to consulting God by means of the ephod, David has recently laid aside that practice and has acted unilaterally. When the king asked the deity where he, relocating from Philistia, should live, God indicated that Hebron was the place. David, unconsulting, took Jerusalem, named it for himself, settled there. Deciding next to move God's ark to the city of David, and again not conferring with the deity, the king precipitates a death by insisting on the ark's transit. Insofar as we can name the ark as God's responsive presence, we see it react under the handling it receives when David orchestrates its transfer. David delays his plan briefly, but then, leading new liturgy, brings God's ark to the city of David. God says nothing further, though David's wife, Michal, observing the ceremony as a non-participant, names the event as an act of arrogance. How the king has honored himself today is her appraisal of his liturgy, likely not far wrong. And so, flushed with what he takes for royal success, David next undertakes to build a temple for God, a deed his prophet Nathan approves, also without consultation. But finally now, unequivocally, unambiguously, God pushes back, instructing Nathan to inform David that God is the builder of houses and dynasties for David, not David, the builder of a stately house for God. Some of David's sins have been more popular to portray visually than his royal arrogance, but we have art to view now and to read. Many human shortcomings root in arrogance, and David's condition may be what we can read in Achilles, sustaining his vast anger. Perhaps we are familiar with arrogance more locally. These are not strange or unfamiliar states for us, even if we wear smaller sizes than do Achilles and David. David's arrogance, were we to read his narrative more slowly, arises from his talent and success. Like Achilles, King David has an excellence beyond others. Everyone loves David, God included. David is difficult to resist. When God finally does draw the line so unmistakably that it cannot be misunderstood, David does not bluster. David's sins are not small or few, but he does not cling to them or long deny them. Shown, he acknowledges his blindness. And so we have him here, on his knees, in intense prayer, offered by Giambattista Pettoni. How to read this scene. If you can grant me David's sins of arrogance with God's ark, first grabbing a city from the blind and the lame and naming it for himself, next initiating the move of God's ark even at the cost of human life, then overriding that divine nudge to wrest the ark into the city, and finally undertaking to be a temple builder for God, we bring that context to what we see. I am inferring, reading, overreach in texts where others see deeds of glory, the taking of Jerusalem, the transfer of the ark, the promise of a dynasty. Can I do that? Let's see. Artists are not simply illustrators, but interpreters, as are readers. Some quick descriptive comments about the painting. There are other humans shown in motion, even a dog if you look carefully, but David seems oblivious of them, his attention fixed on the ark, which, as suggested, is God's responsive presence among humans. The work's bottom edge shows a cushion draped across 2 steps and a harp. On the right side, we see the Ark of the Covenant, a golden chest with 2 cherubim on its cover, wings touching, as is described in the directions for the construction of worship apparatus, Exodus 25. It rests on a firm structure with a white cloth flowing down from beneath it, drawing our attention as well as David's to the ark. King David's face is angled slightly as he yearns toward or implores the ark in some way for some response. We glimpse only part of his face, white beard, neck, dark hair, and crown. Cheryl Exum, art historian and biblical scholar, challenges viewers about interrogating a scene like this one so that we move beyond description. She urges us to name the problems offered to the viewer for negotiation, to inquire how they work here. David struggling to grow away from arrogance and toward compassion. That is, we need to grasp the problem that this work is aiming to resolve with us. 3 questions help us to move in on the central visual challenge. First, how can we explore the encounter between the human David and the divine character Yahweh, absent the participation of other humans? Nathan, messenger between God and David in the verbal narrative, is absent visually. Second, how will we read, draw out, and name the emotion of David engaging the deity through the ark? What precisely is he feeling, and what asking? If the press of ark misadventures I have just named makes it a particular focus, what is David best or well understood to be desiring? Third, how can David's engagement with the ark be convincingly shown as productive or satisfying for him or us, since visually the ark cannot be responsive as a character, but is shown rather as a stationary box? How are any helped by seeing a fraught David engaging an inanimate structure? How will we infer the ark's and the deity's responsiveness easier in verbal narrative than in visual? Finally, as we read this text, verbal and visual, can we gain insight into any capacity for compassion? As we look closely, our eye joins the king and the apparently inanimate ark. Each is garbed in white and gold, color cascading between them. David's outstretched arms and the wings of the cherubim match each other. David does not always extend his arms in prayer, while the ark's angels do always take that pose, if involuntarily, their gestures echoing David's. But the ark is God's ark, so involuntary is not quite the right word. Though David has his gaze fixed on the ark, shown by the angle of his head and the eye we can see, the faces of the cherubim are fixed on each other. Though David's precise posture is not easy to see due to the drapery of his garments, we can observe that he is not kneeling on the cushion which lies across the stairs, though he may have been doing so before he moves. Nor is he at present playing his harp, which is cast down rather than placed more carefully. If David's cushion and harp sometimes suggest ease and opulence, their present abject position hints the opposite. So David can be seen as having broken off 2 more normal modes of communion with God to implore the ark of God. David's arms spread, fingers intense, head bent, body angled, one knee bent on a stair. Is David regretting his plans for the ark? It's being brought by him into a city he seized from the blind and the lame. Is he repenting of his disregard for the human life lost when the ark was taken from where it had been recovering from a multitude of indignities? Can we construe the king as facing the arrogance of his own temple-building plans, announced to and approved by his prophet, until they are countered explicitly and at length by God? Is David shocked and grieved at how seriously he has misconstrued God's plans about city and ark and temple? Is this David, our David, feeling contrition, compunction, a firm desire to respond more graciously to what God might be desiring, to turn toward it? David seems to me to express something while asking something. His arms extended both to lack and receive something. His white beard signifies that he has reached a certain age or experience, though remaining vital. His crown and clothing suggest his rank, but his posture marks him as an intense suppliant. David then is deeply engaged, verbally and visually, asking God's mercy and perhaps healing from his excesses. As David turns toward God, it is surely in the expectation that God's graciousness has already anticipated his move. So, is David's prayer answered, responded to by God, or not? How might a response be signified? I spent a long time studying this text, stymied by the challenge of how to catch such a moment, missing any response to David's clear imploring, until Dr. Andrea Schaefer, art historian and biblical scholar, also reading it, pointed out to me the cloud of smoke billowing forth from the ark toward the right of the scene as viewed. Its most obvious literary referent is testimony about Moses and his intense participation with the deity. The narrator describing how, when Moses entered the tent where he conversed with God, the space filled with smoke, and all observing understood that Moses and God were in intimate communion. It's in Exodus 33. Thus nudged, I suggest that in this painting, God is shown responsive to David's prayer, merciful to the suppliant in the presence of the ark toward which he has arguably, on more than one occasion, acted arrogantly. David can thus be read as expressing regret, pleading for mercy, hoping for compassion to be both received by and engendered in him. The biblical narratives assure us that David's contemptuous actions, when finally checked by the deity and then readily owned by the king, are forgiven. That David has more poor choices ahead of him does not make such a moment unlikely. To regret an action or a series of them, to be prompted to acknowledge a pervasive pattern, does not mean it will not recur. I suspect we all know that. But here David is shown reassured of God's compassion for him. It's reaching out to fill the space where David asks it. The compatibility of hearts, the strange resemblance between Yahweh's being and David's self, invites us to see David leaning into the process of learning compassion through experiencing it, learning to extend it by receiving it. Can God do that? Can David? Can we? Our earlier reading of Priam and Achilles, prompted by gods and advised by Hermes, helps us read David here, perhaps grieving for the many who have died as he built his kingship. My claim is not that the ancient and dying Achaean culture, so brilliantly pictured in Homer's poems, set out to valorize compassion. And though many biblical texts glorify kingship, they also testify to monarchy's many abuses of power and certainly lay those bare for our consideration. So, reading sacred texts is complex. We rely on their composers to be wise, on their narrative scores to be spacious and supple, on their characters to be deep. The reading process also asks a good deal from us, not least a willingness to be challenged in our weak spots. Compassion is on offer in the best of our texts, but we need to be in shape. Practice is crucial, and yet we do not chin our way into insight and conversion. It comes as a gift, but courtesy and respect may be its attendants, as well as an awakened critical sense. Can we do that? Let us now listen to a text we all likely know, Psalm 23, set to music, and its language adapted. The point, especially if this is your first hearing, is not to like the piece, though I hope you will, but listen to what it activates in you. As it concludes, it will last about 3 minutes. We will leave a brief pause and then have questions and responses to whatever has caught your eye, ear, mind, and heart.
The Lord is my shepherd, I have all I need. She makes me lie down in green meadows, beside the still waters she will lead. She restores my soul, she rights my wrongs. She leads me in a path of good things, and fills my heart with songs. Even though I walk through a dark and dreary land, there is nothing that can shake me. She has said she won't forsake me, I'm in her hand. She sets a table before me in the presence of my foes. She anoints my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely, surely goodness and kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in her house forever, forever and ever. Glory be to our Mother and Daughter, and to the Holy of Holies, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
So we thank Barbara for what we've heard. And as she very cleverly wove in an invitation for questions and discussion and responses, I think we have time for that now, and if you're, I'd just let you follow on.
I thought that's what you were here to do.
Well, no, but I will, I'll help if there's
If a fight breaks out, right. So anything that you'd like to say, some people like to respond right away, some people don't, and we won't do this for very long. You've all eaten and had a little snack, so you're not hungry. So any comment that you'd like to offer? Eric.
get started, sure. I don't even know how to frame this question. As Dr. Green knows, I'm right now in my comps phase of my PhD, and one of the things I'm struggling with, one of the questions I'm struggling with is, what exactly is Scripture, right? Dealing with rewritten Bible. So I'm kind of taking from this is that Scripture itself is not defined as the literary text per se, but that which it evokes within the human being or within the reader. Like you said, there's no Lone Ranger. So, you know, you need this sort of cacophony of voices to understand the Scripture itself. Am I stating that correctly?
Yeah. I wouldn't want to eliminate the text because, of course, it's a sacred text that we're reading, but we're reading a sacred text, and depending, again, this is a disputed question, the issue of what Scripture is. If Scripture is God's self-disclosure with us through a narrative text, and then we respond to it, share it with each other, embody it in our lives, struggle with it, and so forth. It's all of those things, I think. But it's surely around a sacred text. Okay. No question about that. It's a great question.
Right. Right, because right now, you know, rewritten Bible, is that Scripture?
Right, that's the question you're on in your comps.
Yes, so I'm trying to kind of...
That's good. You can move on to the next one now.
Figured me out.
Good. Yes, Marianne.
Barbara, I was, as you were talking about the text and saying, can we do that? Can we engage the text the way you're asking? I was thinking of the basic Christian communities when they read text together.
Right.
And maybe in that reading text together and breaking it open, they ask each other,
Right.
can God do that?
Right.
And it's the community that says,
Right.
hell yeah, he can do that,
Right.
she can do that.
Right.
And that encourages more reading.
Right.
You want to say something about that in terms of, again, not the Lone Ranger.
Right.
The idea of basic Christian communities instilling a kind of trust and a confidence in, yeah, God can do that.
Right. Even though we all know it's important to pray and read by ourselves, to do it in a group is really crucial, and to do it in groups that aren't just like us, not the same group decade after decade, but branch out and do different things, even if, and maybe especially if occasionally it's uncomfortable, because that's how it stays alive and vital. And, you know, take our Bibles places and introduce them to new friends, and then when they have to sleep briefly on a coffee table, they at least have new things to think about. So I think the importance of being challenged, because even if we're challenged by something and we don't like it, maybe in a year we'll like it, maybe in a day or two we'll like it, and if we don't like it, we'll probably forget it, and that'll be okay too. But yes, to keep stirred up, to keep active, I think is crucial, right? Andrew.
Yeah, especially in these days, we are reading the Acts of the Apostle after the Easter, and especially today, these disciples of Emmaus, and when they encountered this stranger,
Right.
Oh, foolish you are.
Right.
You didn't know?
Yeah, Luke 24, this is.
Yeah. So reading the scripture is supposed to bring you here.
Right, right, right.
So how, so probably our job, how to, as they did in the beginning,
Right.
to read this sacred text,
Right.
and how we interpret it in our lives.
Yeah. Good. I think what they're doing in that story, and it was at the liturgy for today, the disciples are leaving Jerusalem. So this is in Luke chapter 24. They're leaving Jerusalem disappointed in what they thought was going to happen, and as far as they know, didn't happen. They're reflecting on their experience. They're joined by somebody, they don't know who it is, and he listens to them, reflect on their experience, and then says to them, you didn't understand quite what was happening before your eyes. And so then what he does is open the scripture to them, reread the passages, sort of the same way that Marianne said. So he read, and they read with new friends, read their experience against the scripture. And then in that story in Luke, he breaks the bread with them as well. And so that's a little paradigm. It's one of the most beautiful of the resurrection stories. So how the combination of our human experience, sad maybe, or happy, because it turned out happy by the end of the story, set against a deep and profound narrative. New Testament Hebrew Bible whatever it happens to be, with a little jarring nudge from their companion who said, you are slow to understand what it was that you've just been through. Let me walk through with you it again, so that they get their experience more deeply, holding it against something else. And then they eat and drink special food. So I think that's exactly what we are encouraged to do with it. Again, it's very social, very interactive, centers around a sacred text, but it isn't simply the sacred text by itself. Teresa.
One of your homework is asking us to comment on Ezekiel or Jeremiah. And one of the questions you say, can they do that? They say very bad things, they're very toxic and harsh things. And you were talking about compassion. Can we do this? We can be compassionate with the prophets in their problem, in their way of trying to communicate. But we don't have to endorse what they say in value.
Right. We don't endorse it. But another point that I wanted to offer to us, and it's taken me a long time to get to this point, we also don't have to slam them and sneer at them and disdain them and so forth. So I think I was clear about David's shortcomings. I'm clear enough about Priams and Achilles, but also recognizing that I carry all those in myself, and if I can be gracious toward them, then maybe I can be gracious toward myself. So I think the avenue, the opening for compassion comes when we both are treated that way and treat other people that way as well. But I agree completely, not to pass over the flaws in our texts. No question about that. So thank you for reminding us of that. Good. Chris.
Acknowledging my own hermeneutic paradigm here, one of the things I think implied, and I'm wondering if it was implied or direct, is that these sacred texts are art forms, and if that is true, most classic art forms are gathering places by the very fact that they're art forms. So just comment on that, if you would, and how the divine can work through the art form.
Right. Okay, and if I don't say quite what you're thinking, then... so as we gather to read a sacred text with people, not always, but often with people, in whatever context we do, including when we do it at liturgy, which is a very privileged place to have it happen, we open ourselves to whatever is happening, whatever we bring with it as we walk into a liturgy or to a study session or a classroom, whatever it is, we bring whatever is happening with us. And then at that site, whether it's verbal or visual or musical or dance, all kinds of things it can be, as we know, then I think what we do is open ourselves with prompts. We aren't just sitting there with nothing saying what's coming into my head, but we're reading these very challenging texts. And as Teresa just reminded us, we all know this, these texts have a lot of toxic things in them. And we know now that we aren't going to take our scissors and snip those out and that we will have gotten all of them. There's always more. And so it's on us to figure out how to make these art signs, these places where we come to engage sacred texts, it's on us to make them as fruitful as we can for whoever we're reading with, for ourselves and so forth. And maybe sometimes to allow the toxic parts to have their way as well. There's a strand of thought, it's not always my favorite one, but that's exactly what I'm saying. We don't have to always do our favorite thing, where people say, let the sexist texts be sexist, let the ones that are violent be violent, so that people who feel that that's what's running through their lives have an opportunity to sort of cheer with it and do with it what they want. So I think it's not on us to censor them, but to be alert to the various ways in which they offer us great things, painful things, challenging things, consoling things. And what we get on one page, tomorrow we may get something quite different on that. That's part of the vitality of what we've got in our texts, all of them. Yes?
I just wanted to thank you for broadening the category of sacred text to include Stravinsky, Beethoven. Fair.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, you say a little bit more about the experience of dissonance as useful in sacred text.
Right. Well, I think some of the dissonance, again, can be where a sacred text angers us or shocks us or makes us cry. That also can happen. A text that we've read many times, we read it afresh or we hear it at a funeral or whatever, and it overpowers us in a new way. So I think for us to be open to all of those possibilities and to find ways to not let it become predictable to us, somehow to take whatever precautions we need to do so that it remains vital in our midst and that we haven't tamed it down so that it is just a coffee table creature. Our Bibles really want to be a lot more than that. All of our sacred texts do, and so they count on us to let them roar. And again, reading with different kinds of people is a good way to let that happen. We don't always go home happy, but of course, happy isn't necessarily the point. It's a great question. Yes, Nicole.
I'm sitting here reflecting on how you, as my graduate advisor, influenced how I read. And I think it's alive in your talk tonight is that these texts are alive as we are alive. And the authors, it's as though I'm thinking about it kind of orientation, but the author is behind the text in some way. The text has its own life. We have our own life. And it's all being told through time. Yeah. So, and even in the communities that are varied, that we might read them through, there are all these ways that text and art and music and dance can live. And it's these different layers of life that I think you so beautifully articulate in your work. And I just want to thank you for it.
Good. I like the way you say that, reminding us how multidimensional it is and how complex in a good way it is that we can wander in and wander around and be hit on the head or fall down and scrape our knee or whatever, and we're still having an experience that is helpful for us and profound and may jar us into something that we were straining for but weren't able quite to do by ourselves. So it's gratifying to me to hear so many of you reflect on what you're doing in your own lives too. I want to mention Andrea Schaefer here, who helped me read the painting, is sitting right here in the front row. Okay, any other thought on this? Anyone want to comment on the last piece, the Psalm 23? Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
Why you chose that as your last piece?
How
you put that together with the rest?
I guess I wanted, the first time I heard it, I wasn't sure I liked it. I don't know if I would order it at my funeral, but I know that it affects many people in many ways, and it's beautiful. This is a funny thing. When I was doing this, I thought, I wonder if I'm going to have to pay him $1,000 million in royalties. All of my other things are loving hands at home. So I picked it because, again, it jars because it takes a text that we are familiar with and changes the gender all the way through. And no matter how liberal we may feel that we are, sometimes we say, oof, imagine such a thing. So those little oofs are, I think, good for us. So not to do it to upset people, but to do it to see how we feel when we read. If we never have any feelings when we're reading, we're probably not really reading too well. Yes, Andrew.
Just a separate comment on the last piece of music, because he composed after the death of his mother.
Okay, thank you for telling us that. Good, so life context. Good, so he probably did play that at her funeral. Right, yes.
And I'll just add to that, my stepmother passed away and she requested that at her funeral. And the pastor who was at the church at the time would not allow us to play.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so we played it at the reception
Good.
really loud.
That's good, yeah. And so it had its voice.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're done.
Last chance? All right. Well, as Barbara has helped us to appreciate that the sacred text is not just what's on the page, it's what happens between us and the text, among us, as we read the text together. And certainly the same is true for this lecture tonight. It's not just what the words that you read to us, it's the experience that we've had together.
Right.
And we'll continue to have as we finish up the rest of the food and continue the conversation. Barbara, you've given us a lot to think about, to pray about, to talk about together, and we're very grateful for that.